history behind cereal, something an estimated 283 million Americans consume each year, is one of innovation, health advice years if not decades ahead of its time, and a changing economy, but also a darkness that drove two brothers who spent every day of their younger years working together to grow irreconcilably apart, battling in both business and the courtroom on an ideological level. The story behind the so-called most important meal of the day is one of betrayal, backstabbing, and a rift in a family where sorry came just a little too late. This is Learn Something New. In the colonial era of the United States, people, especially ordinary working-class people, had a tendency to either eat porridge or leftovers from the night before when it came time for breakfast. But as the new nation grew wealthier, breakfast meals got bigger. There's a trend that started with the European elite to have giant breakfast buffets with an assortment of meats, like ham, sausage, and eggs. And during the 19th century, these large breakfast spreads became extremely common, especially after the industrialization of beef and pork production in Midwest cities like Chicago and Cincinnati. This was particularly true in rural areas where large, meat-heavy morning meals fueled farmers and laborers for their days of work. And then came the Industrial Revolution. More people were laboring in factories, shops, or offices, which ran on standardized schedules, leaving less time for food preparation and consumption throughout the work week. And this change led to a German immigrant to try and innovate on the breakfast process. Ferdinand Schumacher started producing oats in the back room of his store in Akron, Ohio in 1854. Eventually, he would turn this side project into a full-blown company. It was called German Mills American Oatmeal Company, later becoming the Quaker Oats Company. At around the same time the first cold breakfast cereal was coming into being, it was called Granula, and was invented by James Caleb Jackson. After that, George H. Hoyt created Wheatna, a type of cereal, and started selling it in boxes instead of by the pound. These early variants were not well received, because they had to be soaked overnight so that they could be edible in the morning. People were interested in the idea of having a quick breakfast before work, but they needed something better. And that brings us to John Harvey Kellogg. John Harvey Kellogg was born February 26, 1852, in Tyrone, Michigan. Raised in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, known at the time for its strict beliefs in abstaining from alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine, while promoting a strict vegetarian diet, Kellogg was known in his community as being stringent with these guidelines. Even after gaining a medical degree, Kellogg kept these beliefs held closely. In 1876, he transformed a health institute in Battle Creek, Michigan into what would become a world-famous medical spa and resort, known as the Battle Creek Sanitarium. This would be the birthplace of the cereal that we know today. While running the sanitarium, Kellogg would promote his philosophy of biologic living, emphasizing regular exercise, massage therapy, and drinking plenty of water. Beneficial practices as we know of them today, but he had quite a few notions that were much further off the mark that we'll get into later. Around 1877, Dr. Kellogg concocted a twice-baked mixture of flour, oats, and cornmeal, which he only began smashing into small pieces to eat after one of his patients broke her tooth on a larger version. He believed that by baking the whole grains at high temperatures, a process called dextrinization, they became more easily digestible, and therefore more healthy. And this is where the story of who actually perfected the formula for the cornflakes that would launch the Kellogg name gets a little blurry, as both John's wife and his brother, who worked alongside him in the kitchen, claim to have played a key role in the flakes' invention, as do other sanitarium employees. According to company history, it was one night in 1898 when a batch of wheat-based cereal dough was accidentally left out for an extended period of time, causing it to ferment. When rolled out into thin sheets, the slightly moldy dough produced perfectly large, thin flakes that became crispy and tasty in the oven. And while John continued to run his sanitarium, his brother was more interested with the flakes. Over the next several years, Will Kellogg kept experimenting with the recipe and figured out that corn, rather than wheat, produced even crunchier, crispier flakes, Patients at the sanitarium loved the new cereal flakes. Will Kellogg, meanwhile, saw the opportunity to market the flakes to ordinary people looking for a light, healthy breakfast. And after years of humiliation, working as his brother's assistant, including being forced to take notes of John Harvey's experience on the toilet, Will decided to buy the rights of the flake cereal recipe and create his own company around it, founding the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company in 1906. Adding malt, sugar, and salt to the dough, he began manufacturing Kellogg's cornflakes in mass quantities and pouring much of the profits into advertising. By 1909, Will's company was churning out 120,000 cases of cornflakes a day. John Kellogg, who resented his brother's success, later fought him for the right to use the family name. The resulting legal battle ended in 1920, when the Michigan State Supreme Court ruled in Will's favor, due to his success at popularizing the now ubiquitous product. But by the time Will Kellogg attempted to secure dominance in the market, others had already begun to capitalize on the general public's appetite for cereal. Among the most successful was C.W. Post, a former patient at the Battle Creek Sanitarium who couldn't afford to pay the fees for his stay, instead accepting his care in exchange for a job at the facility's kitchen, which gave him a front row seat to the methods that they had been using to make their new cereal. Post adapted Kellogg's cereal recipe into his own mass-produced version, Grape Nuts, to tremendous success. As a cutthroat competitor to Kellogg, Post even bought the exclusive rights to manufacture the cereal rolling machine needed in the cereal production process, equipment that Will Kellogg originally helped design. And with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in the late 19th century, the United States was now linked to an unprecedented degree, creating a mass market for Kellogg, Post, and other newly recognizable packaged food brands to sell their wares to. Despite the sometimes outrageous claims made in their advertising, Post, for instance, claimed that grape nuts cured everything from rickets to malaria, the growing variety of brand name companies promised a certain level of quality and uniformity, especially as Americans began to consume processed foods in mass quantities for the first time. With their irresistible combination of health claims and convenience, combined with the unique circumstances of the historical moment in which they emerged, Kellogg's cornflakes and other cereals would have a revolutionary impact on the American breakfast. But their legal battles wouldn't be the only thing that drove the two brothers further apart, as John Harvey Kellogg became more invested in his eccentric beliefs. At his sanitarium, he claimed that using light baths, shining artificial light onto people could cure diabetes, insomnia, and syphilis. He also had the idea of giving people mild shocks from a device he made from telephone parts that he said could treat lead poisoning, obesity, and when used directly on patients' eyes, vision disorders. John Harvey Kellogg was also a big supporter of the eugenics movement, segregation, and even promoted Michigan's forced sterilization law. His brother Will, on the other hand, after a lifetime of growing the Kellogg Company, dedicated himself to giving away his wealth through his foundation, at times to movements that were directly opposed to his brother's beliefs. John Harvey Kellogg was an enigma of a man who dedicated himself to a life of treating people any way that he could think of, but he was also a deeply flawed individual whose belief that he knew what was best for everyone would drive him and his brother apart, never to reconcile. Though, in 1943, John Kellogg looked back at his life and sought to make amends, writing a letter apologizing to his brother, saying, "I earnestly desire to make amends for any wrong or injustice of any sort I have done to you. I am sure that you were right as regards the food business. Your better balanced judgment has doubtless saved you from a vast number of mistakes of the sort that I have made, and allowed you to achieve magnificent successes for which generations to come will owe you gratitude." But John would never hear back from Will, as John's secretary, worried about how the letter would make her boss look, didn't mail it. Later that year, John died, never reconciling with his brother. But 5 years later, when Will was 88 years old and nearing his own death, he was given the letter. In his last years, Will was blind. His favorite activity was to be driven to the Kellogg plant, park there, and listen to the noises from the factory, his factory. He had gone from uneducated assistant to a world-renowned entrepreneur, and learning just before he passed that he had won his brother's respect. Thank you for watching Learn Something New. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.